Who are the top 5 players on offense for the Dallas Cowboys heading into the 2023 season? All that more this episode of Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked on Cowboys. Locked on Cowboys.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Landon McCool. You can check him out on Twitter at McCoolBCB. Landon, how you doing today, sir?
Doing well. I'm excited because this is kind of the week that we might actually start getting some stuff out of OTAs. But the veterans are mixing in with the rookies, so they're at least going to start practicing together. So maybe we get some alignment stuff. Maybe we get some who's out there first stuff. Just the very, very, very beginnings of the season kind of starting to take place, which is, it sneaks up on us suddenly, and it's exciting.
And until then, we're going to do some more stuff to start looking ahead to the 2023 season. Last week, I believe last Thursday, we put together a list, actually Landon's list of the top 5 players on the Cowboys. Just to recap, was Zach Martin, Micah Parsons, I believe CeeDee Lamb, Dak Prescott, and Stephon Gilmore. Today, we're taking a look at his top 5 players on offense for the Cowboys with a couple rules. The first rule is we're not allowed to use any of the players that he previously mentioned. So again, it's a top 5 list of the offensive players for the Cowboys, not including Zach Martin, Dak Prescott, and CeeDee Lamb. We're going to count our way down from 5 to 1. Let's go to number 5, Landon, who is?
Number 5 on the offensive list is Michael Gallup. And I think this is, it's funny because we start with...
this is a controversial ranking already. This is fun.
That's what I was going to say. We start at the bottom, so that probably means that we start with the controversy, right? Because as you get close to the top, there's not going to be a ton of arguing. I am still a believer in Michael Gallup. I think that, and I understand that this is a controversial selection here, but I think that Gallup, with the addition of Brandin Cooks, kind of slots back into a role that he's probably more comfortable with. He's a year away from his injury, and look, I think if we had gone through the entire year last year of not seeing Michael Gallup do any of the stuff that he had ever done previously, I would be concerned about his long-term future. But that's not necessarily the case. We saw Gallup, occasionally flash Michael Gallup of old. The issue was finding any kind of consistency, even at the end of the year as he had gotten further away from the injury. I think another year removed, another off season gets him closer to. He's not old. He's still a relatively young player. Another year away from the injury gets him closer back to what he was health wise previously. And I think the role change puts him back into a comfort zone that allows him to play the way he had previously. If we get the Michael Gallup we had 2 years ago, I don't think anybody's arguing with me that he's number 5 on this list. And I think that his production will become very valuable as the kind of the only real true X on this team. And his ability to kind of, win the jump ball and be a valuable third receiver. I think it will certainly earn that 5th spot on this list.
It's a huge year for Michael Gallup. He just turned 27 years old. You would think now that he's, a full year removed from the injury, you would hope that this is the year that he starts to play better. And to his credit, the routes that he's running are really hard, right? He's playing on the outside, and it's all the vertical routes where basically you're going to be in contested catch situations. You're not going to get a bunch of freebies to kind of get you going. So I give him credit there. That's just a really hard role to play. But I also wonder, a lot of his game is based off of contested catch stuff, and that stuff can just be kind of fluky from year to year. So it's hard to sustain that kind of production and be consistent. So I just don't know. Honestly, he is such an X factor for them this year, but I also don't know if he's somebody that you can rely on at all.
Yeah, I mean it'll be interesting to see. I mean honestly, I think we could do a whole segment on coin flip scenarios, right? Where guys that if it goes positively, things could be huge for the Cowboys, and if
Yep.
it goes negatively, it could be a huge blow. Michael Gallup, returning to form would be a huge boon for this
Yes.
offense. And if it doesn't happen, then the Cowboys are going to have to find a way to kind of work around that a little bit. I mean, if it's similar to last year, but I just have a hard time believing it will be similar to last year. I think if you ask me straight out, which season do I feel like Michael Gallup will have a repeat of, or at least which season will it look most resemble the most of?
Yep.
I would say to me, I think it's more likely that he looks closer to the player 2 years ago than the player that came off the injury last year.
I will say one thing that is concerning for me is one of my favorite stats for a receiver is yards per target. Basically, how efficient are you when you're targeted? His yards per targets numbers have dropped 4 consecutive seasons. In 2019, 9.8, 8.0 in 2020, which that's the season you're mentioning. If he's that, fantastic. That's great. 7.2 in 2021, 5.7 in 2022. I think that was like worst or second worst in the NFL. If they can just get him back to that 8.5, they'll be fine.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that too, you have to think about is like it's a combination of usage plus obviously the injury recovery too, right? So I agree. If he can get back to being kind of a more, the third target with more explosive targets down the field, I think that's better for his game for sure.
All right. What about number 4?
For number 4, I mean, again, the bottom is the toughest spot, right? Like I think for number 4, I put Tyler Smith. I just think the value that you're getting, even as a rookie last year, look, if he had come in and play, gone through training camp as a left tackle and then went out and played left tackle the way that he played left tackle, I think he probably would be number 5 or number 6 on the list. The fact that you got him to do that while training him all offseason to be a guard, I think shows you the value in this guy. And the fact, again, he is the piece now that is going to make this offensive line right. Like if you can't figure out Tyron Smith at left tackle, he's gonna play left tackle. If Tyler Smith is fine, he's gonna move into guard. And the fact is that you're gonna get what you feel like is a high level of play from that position, no matter where he is. And to me, like again, we're just to kind of reset the table. We are doing this based on where we feel the player is right now.
Yeah.
So
does this mean that one of these other offensive linemen aren't on the list?
No, that doesn't mean that. There is another offensive lineman on the list.
I just said should there be 2 other ones on the list?
Well, I think. Well, I mean, we've already got Zach Martin on here, right? So I think we've got one other guy who I feel like is on the list, and then another guy that is not on the list that we can have a conversation about.
We'll save that for later.
Not on the list.
Well, yeah. Let's talk about Tyler Smith.
So Tyler Smith, again, I just think as a guy who was able to kind of step in and do a very difficult thing kind of with a lot of ease, he didn't play as like top 5 or a top 10 offensive tackle, but he also was probably the only one of the offensive tackles in the league that, started almost every game in his position without taking almost a single snap at that position in training camp, while also being a rookie, by the way, who played at Tulsa. Like I think it's just really difficult to kind of quantify how difficult what Tyler Smith did last year was. And so the fact that he's now comfortable with what he's doing, he's a year into training as a full-time player. I expect a very large leap from him. I mean, honestly, I was tempted to put him a little bit higher, but I think, this is a safe floor for me to be putting him in with the expectations where they are.
I think we're going to see a massive jump for him from year 1 to year 2. I mean, I know not every player has a linear progression like Madden, right? Like if you play the Madden video games, everybody gets better every single year, right? That's not always the case. However, with Tyler Smith, you can make a really good argument why he's going to make that leap, right?
Oh, yeah.
For all the reasons you mentioned, played at Tulsa, didn't get to play left tackle in training camp, was playing guard. There was a ton of change at left guard next to him, right? Like they were cycling in left guards all year because of injuries, right? They still might be doing that again this year, but you would think in year 2 with him focusing on one spot, which we don't even know if that's the case yet. Like we think he's going to start at left tackle, but we'll see. But Yeah, I got to believe he's going to be really good this year. So I've got no problem at all putting him at number 4. I'm really curious, though, Landon, to see who comes in at your top 3 spots. We will get to those guys next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs because right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That is $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. If you're betting on the NBA, I highly recommend not betting on the Lakers to win the series. We don't need to talk about that any further, but there's no better place to bet on all the playoff action than America's #1 sports book. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That is FanDuel.com/LockedOn. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Everydayers, we want to thank you for listening to this show every single day. Tomorrow, we're going to be breaking down Landon's top 5 defensive players for the Cowboys going into the 2023 season. So make sure you tune in for that. All right, Landon, you're at number 3. You have...
All right, so this is going to be, I'm going to name the name, and then the implication about what we've just discussed is going to fall into place, and people are going to get very upset, I think. And honestly, I'm a little upset with myself still. Number 3 is Terence Steele.
I have no problem with this at all.
Because I think that Terence Steele has shown that, as he played on the right side, he was one of the dominant weapons that the Cowboys were using to deploy against folks. I mean, there's a reason the running game was working so well. There's a reason that they ran behind Terence Steele when they were running the football. Terence Steele has become one of, if not the best run blocking offensive tackles in football.
Yeah.
And look, we can have a separate conversation in a second when we're done talking about Terence, about the fact that this is the last offensive lineman on the list, and Tyron Smith is not on this list.
No Tyler Biadasz, Pro Bowl center.
No, not so much. But I think that what we should focus on right now is that I think the conversation, the reason that the conversation about moving Terence Steele to guard, it was so, it felt insulting is because of what Terence Steele has done on the right side and how hard he has worked to get as good as he has. We all remember.
Did you see that report that was news to him that nobody asked him ever about playing left guard?
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me, right? Like, and I think honestly, if I remember correctly, you and I called that as BS when it came out.
Yeah,
and I think it's because guys like Terence Steele is playing really good at tackle, like,
and if they want to get their best 5 on the field, that's not the way they do it. And I think they know that, right? Like, it's to move Tyler Smith inside the left guard.
And I think this also ties into the conversation about Tyron Smith, right? Is that we all just need to recognize the fact that Tyron Smith is still playing decent football when he's playing, but he's not Tyron Smith of 4 years ago.
He's not the all-pro Tyler.
Yeah, he's not physically dominating guys the way he was. He's better than average for sure. But
let me ask you a question. Do you think? Yeah. Well, we never even really saw him play left tackle last year, so it's even hard to say that.
Yeah.
But do you think he's a better left tackle right now than Tyler Smith is?
I think that there's a conversation, and I think the fact that that's a conversation versus a, Hall of Fame left tackle. I think he's in a conversation for potentially wearing the gold jacket after he's done. And a rookie tackle just shows you kind of where both of these folks are in their career.
Here's what I would, not to interrupt, but I would say 2021 Tyron was better than 22 Tyler Smith. The problem is
that's
the arrows are
exactly
in the wrong direction.
It's just like the Stephon Gilmore, Trayvon Diggs conversation that we'll have tomorrow, honestly, is that, they're crossing like ships in the night, but one's pointed one way and one's pointed the other way, right?
Yeah.
So I think that, look, I just, and again, what are we doing here? We're not talking about Terence Steele. We're talking about Tyron Smith again.
Let's get back to Terence Steele.
That's the problem, right? Yeah. That's the issue, is that this is not about Tyron Smith. This is about how good Terence Steele is, right?
Yes.
He needs to clean some things as a pass protector. That's where the issue is that they still need to get him better as a pass protector, because he's average to below average at that spot. And you can't have that as a tackle, but he's so dominant as a run blocker that he's a weapon on this team to the point where, again, I had to go back and forth a little bit between the Tyler Smith and the Terence Steele issue, but I just came back to the fact that, honestly, when the Cowboys had their druthers about how they wanted to attack teams, they attacked teams by running the football behind Terence Steele. And that's honestly, throughout the season, when he was healthy, that was maybe the most effective way that they were able to move the football.
Yeah, and the injury is the only thing that clouds things here a little bit, right? Because if you're just basing it off play last year, it wasn't comparable between who was the better tackle for the Cowboys. And they showed you that because they ran to the right all the time last year because it was so successful. But I agree. I think Terence Steele had to be on this list. 3 feels about right. I also saw a report today that Terence Steele is ahead of schedule. They expect him to be ready for training camp. We'll see. We heard the same things about Michael Gallup last year, but it does feel like, or it does seem like
easier position to come back from.
And it happened earlier, right? Steele's happened.
And it happened earlier. Yeah.
Week 10, week 11 or something like that, where Michael Gallup was week 17. So that's the difference in a month and a half. So we'll see. What about player number 2?
Player number 2 is the newcomer, Brandin Cooks.
I
think he comes in right away with the pedigree that we've all talked about. And I think, it's going to change the angles of the offense in a way that it hasn't we haven't had an addition to the Cowboys offense like this that has changed it like this. So I think that it's going to allow Gallup to kind of slot into his spot. It's going to take away some of the attention away from CeeDee Lamb. It's going to make things easier. And just by his speed, you're going to vertically stretch the defense to provide more room for everyone to operate underneath, including the tight ends and running backs. So, Brandin Cooks is a guy who has a kind of a very NBA career, right? He's a good player who has bounced around at a bunch of different teams, just for whatever reason, but not because he wasn't wanted or not because he wasn't a good player, because he is an extremely high-end wide receiver 2, who probably isn't a wide receiver 1, and I think that's where teams have felt like they maybe have mispurchased him, but have gotten good. It's interesting, right? Teams have gotten him and felt like they didn't get what they wanted, but got a lot of production out of him still, right? Like they were hoping for wide receiver 1, but instead they got just the most high-end wide receiver 2 that you can get. The Cowboys went into this with open eyes. They knew exactly what they're getting from this guy, that he's putting him right where it feels appropriate for his skill set. And I think he's going to perform for them quite nicely.
One of the things I'm really interested to see with Brandin Cooks is go look through his career. Yeah. He's really never been in a situation where he's the clear number 2 receiver, right? Like, I'll read through it. Like, the last 3 years in Houston, he was their number 1 option, right? In 2019 with the Rams, that was a little bit of the Cooper Kupp year, but Cooper Kupp still wasn't the same.
He still hadn't broken out quite yet. Yeah.
2018, it was him and Robert Woods had almost identical receiving yards. He was the number 1 in New England. 2016, he was the number 1 with the Saints. Same thing, 15 and 14. Like, now that he's playing with the CeeDee Lamb, who is the bona fide number 1 receiver, I think Cooks is going to feast as that number 2 guy that sees only single coverage. It's just going to be a unique spot for him. And you mentioned why so many teams move on from him is because he really doesn't project as that number 1 guy. But if he's in your number 2 role, like he kind of was for the Rams back in, 2018, that's the year that he averaged over 10 yards a target for the Rams. Like, he was so awesome.
Yeah, and that's what you're hoping for if you're a Cowboys fan, is you see all that production. You see that when he gets the kind of downgraded attention, that he truly thrives. I mean, it's very similar to a Dante Fowler situation, right? Sure. Where Fowler spent entirely, and he was even with the Rams, right? Dante Fowler spent a lot of time as kind of the main pass rusher and focus on many teams, and it just didn't find a lot of success there because he was very good, but not quite beating double coverage or beating double teams good, right? You put him into Robert Quinn, I think would be described that same situation. You put him in the kind of Robin role to a Batman, and then that's too much for that defense. They can't. He's better than that. He's better than your second corner. He just isn't quite good enough to be facing double teams the entire time and still produce at a high level the way someone like CeeDee Lamb does. So this is a situation where he could really, truly produce quite a lot simply because he's in a situation that is favorable to his skill set in a way that he hasn't had previously.
He might not have the biggest raw numbers, but I expect him to be highly efficient in this offense, right? Where there's going to be a lot of games where it's 6 targets for 6 catches and 82 yards in a score. Like, I think that's what we can expect from Brandin Cooks this season. So I've got no problem with this one at all. Who is Landon's number 1 player on offense? We'll talk about that one next. All right, Landon. So just to recap, we've got Michael Gallup at 5. We got Tyler Smith at 4, Terence Steele at 3, Brandin Cooks at 2. And remember, no Zach Martin, no Dak Prescott, no CeeDee Lamb. Your number 1 player is?
I mean, obviously, a guy that in both of the top guys on these 2 lists were very much in consideration for number 5 at the overall top list. And this was the name that you and I discussed immediately after I mentioned my number 5 being Stephon Gilmore, Tony Pollard. Yep. It makes a ton of sense. Pollard was, in a lot of ways, the focus of the offense outside of CeeDee Lamb. And at times, maybe even more, as much as the focus of the offense, as CeeDee Lamb. They're another guy who they're hoping will come back from an injury healthy. He's going to have a little bit of a different role than he had previously. And look, this is something that he has worked his way into over the last few years, right? They started to increase his load. Obviously, last year, the idea was to kind of feature him without overloading him on touches, giving Zeke some of that. I think that you're going to see Pollard even take another step forward in touches, but with still a heavy rotation to make sure that his body doesn't get worn out by the end of the season. But this is a guy that has shown to be an explosive playmaking running back with the ball in his hands. He's dangerous. And when the Cowboys were lacking for big plays in the past game, a lot of times you're seeing that they were able to kind of hand the ball off to Tony Pollard and produce huge runs because he's just so dynamic and was able to catch a corner, beat a guy in the open field and suddenly would be gone. So having him back and healthy, I think he's going to be obviously again be a major focus in this offense. And potentially looking for another Pro Bowl, maybe all pro season if he is able to kind of continue the production even with more touches and coming off an injury.
I'm really curious to see how much more his role grows. So last year he had 232 touches, which is by far the most he's ever had. But if you compare that to like other players that are his size and kind of play in a similar fashion, like I look at somebody like Alvin Kamara, right? Yeah. Alvin Kamara has never had a season with over 250 carries. The most he ever had was 240. And in the first 4 years of his career, he averaged 170 carries, a season, but he caught 81 passes. Maybe we'll see something like that where, you're still at 260 to 270 touches, but there's just not a ton more rushing production because they try to keep him fresh in the passing game. Yeah. I won't be surprised if that happens with Pollard, but I mean, by every metric, this should be Pollard's most productive season. Like he is going to get he's going to get a ton of touches.
Yeah. And honestly, it's going to be the part where they're really going to push like what are the maximum amount of touches that they can give him while keeping him effective, right?
I also wonder, like early in the season, how much do they push it?
Yeah.
Right? Like, do they try to find out like early in the season, hey, can we give this guy 23 touches? Or are they going to have more of a long-term view? Like, we want him fresh in January. Let's try to keep him around 16 touches a game and not overwork him.
Yeah. Maybe what they do is they kind of see if they can accelerate Vaughn into the situation where he can kind of take that role maybe early into the season, see if training camp takes well, see if he performs well, and if so, you can kind of lean into maybe giving him some of those carries early as you're trying to kind of work Pollard back in from injury. But yeah, I think it's a little bit of an interesting situation where they have a guy that they want to kind of parse the carries to judiciously, but even beyond that, they need to be careful about what they're doing with him up front because he's coming off of an injury. So it might be that you see kind of an abnormal ratio of carries for someone like Vaughn or some other, or Ronald Jones, Rojo or something like that. Yeah, like I think that those possibilities is getting kind of early percentage of carries just as they kind of work Pollard back in from injury.
Basically to eat up innings like in baseball, right? Like, hey, Ronald Jones, you're going to get You might get 100 carries in the first 6 games of the season and then maybe 100 the rest of the way, right? You know what I mean? Like, I won't be surprised if something like that happens, just so they're not overworking Tony Pollard in September. There's no reason to do that at all, especially if the Cowboys believe they are going to be a playoff contender again.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
I can't see how you can rank anybody ahead of Tony Pollard here. I think he's just the best player. Now, is he the most important? That's a conversation for a different day that we're not going to get into, Landon. But your final rankings here: Michael Gallup at 5, Tyler Smith at 4, Terence Steele at 3, Brandin Cooks at 2, and at number 1, Tony Pollard. And honestly, I think I agree with every single one of them. The only guy that we talked about a little bit was Tyron Smith, but it's really hard to rank Tyler Smith.
You know what it is that it's just weird. It's just weird to have a list like this and not have him on it. And really, because we've been doing stuff like this for the entirety of his career. Right. And he's always been on that list.
Number 1 or number 2, right?
Yeah.
Every year.
And so he's just kind of reached the point in his career where he's not the best player on the team. He's not even the top 10 players not maybe top 10, but not on this list of 8.
He's not even the top 2 tackle on his team right now.
Yeah, and that's weird. You know what? It's okay. That doesn't mean that he's not a useful or player or a starter level player. I think he is both of those things, and I think there's still a chance that he comes in and gives you very good snaps. For the majority of the season. That's the other thing too that I feel like we speak too much is that Tyron played, I think majority of the games last year. So despite having a long-term injury,
we're still once he came back, he played every snap, right?
Yeah. So there is usefulness here. It's not like he's only playing 2 games a season. You just have to plan for that other time.
Well, in 2021, I think he played 13 games, I believe. I don't have the numbers in front of me, which, again, I know you're missing 4 games, but to play 13 games plus a playoff game means that you did play a majority of the season. So we'll see. Always crossing our fingers with Tyron Smith because you just never know. All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you guys for tuning in. As always, you can download the podcast wherever you get your podcast. We are free and available on all platforms. Make sure you guys tune in for tomorrow's show as Landon ranks his top 5 defensive players minus Micah Parsons and Stephon Gilmore. That list is going to be wild because
it is going to be a little wild.
Talent is just ridiculous.
It really was hard, honestly. Yeah. So
go follow Landon on Twitter at McCoolBCB. I'm at Marcus_Mosher, and we'll see you guys next time.